Did you know that behind the best-known Bible stories, there are truths that can transform your life today? At the beginning of Genesis, we are introduced to the creation of the world, but there is much more in this narrative than it seems at first glance. Today, we will explore the powerful lessons hidden in the history of the serpent, its spiritual and practical implications, and how this event shaped humanity's understanding of good, evil, and free will. Get ready to find out how this passage can bring deep revelations to your spiritual walk. What really happened in the Garden of Eden? Is there anything that has not yet been revealed? Stay with us, and you can completely change your perspective on this narrative. The book of Genesis is the gateway to understanding the divine plan for humanity. In it, God shapes the universe with perfection and order, bringing to existence all that we know: light, heaven, earth, and life. Finally, he creates man and woman in his image, trusting them the care of creation. The narrative emphasizes an environment of peace and harmony in the Garden of Eden, where man lives in direct communion with the Creator. Eden, described as a place of delights, was more than a garden. It was the symbol of God's perfect plan for man. There, Adam and Eve had access to divine abundance, but they also carried a responsibility: obedience to a single instruction, which involved not eating the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. This commandment was not a burden, but an invitation to true freedom, based on trust and submission to divine will. The historical context of this narrative leads us to the roots of the Hebrew tradition. Genesis is not just a story, but a way of teaching about the relationship between God and man. For the Israelites, the story of Adam and Eve in Eden represented not only the beginning of the world, but also the beginning of the understanding of sin and the need for redemption. Now think about it. Eden was perfect, but the choice of Adam and Eve has changed everything. Have you ever wondered why God would allow it? Or rather, what does this reveal about the nature of the free will he gave us? Do not leave here, because in the next part, we will delve into this mystery, exploring the figure of the serpent and its crucial role in this fascinating story. The biblical narrative introduces us to Serpent as one of the most intriguing and controversial characters in the history of humanity. In the Garden of Eden, it emerges as a cunning, questioning, and persuasive being, directly challenging the divine instruction given to Adam and Eve. But who or what was the serpent? In the original Hebrew text, the word used for serpent is nachash, a term rich in meanings. In addition to referring to a literal snake, nachash is also related to brightness and guessing ideas. This detail suggests that the serpent, more than an ordinary animal, symbolizes something or someone with a greater purpose. In Christianity, it is widely interpreted as a representation of Satan, God's adversary. But in the original Jewish context, the serpent could be seen as a metaphor for the temptation and testing of human obedience. Historically, the cultures around the ancient Middle East also attributed symbolic meanings to snakes. In Mesopotamia, for example, they were seen as guardians of wisdom and mystical powers. This reinforces the idea that in Eden, the serpent was not just a treacherous creature, but a symbol of something deeper: the choice between trusting God's plan or seeking a way of his own. The interaction of the serpent with Eve is carefully articulated in the text. She does not force the woman to eat for the forbidden fruit, but plants a doubt when asking, "Is that right, God said?" This strategic question challenges the divine order and appeals to human desire for autonomy and knowledge. Eve, attracted by the appearance of the fruit and the promise that he would become as God, gives in to temptation and shares the fruit with Adam. Spiritually, this event marks the beginning of the separation between God and man. Not for an arbitrary punishment, but because the choice of Adam and Eve symbolizes the rejection of the divine plan and the search for independence at the expense of obedience. This fall was not just a human mistake, but a milestone in the spiritual history of humanity, bringing with it the consequences of sin, shame, guilt, and the loss of perfect communion with the Creator. But was the serpent just an opponent, or its role had a greater purpose in the divine plane? Could the Eden test, despite its painful consequences, point to future redemption? Stay with us, because in the next part, we will explore the deepest meaning of this narrative and how it still resonates in our lives today. The original text of Genesis, written in Hebrew, offers layers of meaning that are often lost in modern translations. The key word to understand the paper L of the serpent is nachash, which, as mentioned, can mean serpent, but is also associated with shining or guessing. This linguistic detail leads us to reflect, was the serpent only an animal used as an instrument of temptation, or did it represent something deeper, like a spiritual force intended to test human faith? When looking at Hebrew, we realize that Genesis does not describe the serpent with supernatural attributes, but highlights it for its cunning. The word arum, translated as astute, is also used to describe wisdom or skill. This contrast with the innocence of Adam and Eve, who were not yet aware of good and evil, creates an interesting parallel. The snake personifies the search for knowledge at any cost, while man and woman, in their initial purity, represent confidence in God as a source of all wisdom. Textual nuances also show us that the interaction between Eva and the serpent was not accidental. The serpent chooses her words carefully, challenging God's instruction with a seemingly simple question: "They will certainly not die." Here, Hebrew emphasizes the idea of a promise of immortality or divine power that directly contradicts God's order. It is at this moment that the serpent becomes more than a tempter. She becomes a catalyst of human choice between trusting God or following her own desires. In addition, the Hebrew text reinforces the symbolic importance of trees in Eden. The tree of knowledge of good and evil was not just a moral test, but a marker of boundaries. The Hebrew verb associated with eating, akal, is used in other contexts to describe consummation or appropriation. In other words, when eating from the fruit, Adam and Eve not only disobeyed, but made for themselves the decision to define what was good or bad, a role that belonged exclusively to God. Spiritually, this teaches us a fundamental lesson. True wisdom comes from recognizing our limits before the Creator. When we seek knowledge or power without considering divine will, we risk falling into the same traps as Adam and Eve faced. Now, think about it. Is the snake's temptation something we face daily? In a world where we are constantly encouraged to seek our own truth and ignore divine direction, how can we resist? In the next part, we will explore the serpent's theological and cultural interpretations, diving even deeper into the hidden meanings of this narrative. Stay with us. The figure of the serpent in Genesis transcends the limits of a literal interpretation. Throughout history, it has been reinterpreted by various religious, cultural, and philosophical traditions, revealing its symbolic complexity. In the biblical context, the serpent is seen as the instrument of the fall of man. However, in other historical cultures and periods, the role of this being was associated with both wisdom and betrayal, making it one of the most multiple symbols in human history. In ancient Judaism, the serpent was interpreted as a symbol of transgression, but also as a means of exploring the depths of the relationship between man and God. Some rabbis saw a necessary agent in the serpent for free will to be exercised. The narrative of Genesis, in this sense, is not just about disobedience, but about the tension between obedience and freedom of choice, central elements of Jewish faith. In Christianity, the serpent assumed a more specific connotation. It was widely associated with Satan, particularly through the connection made in the Apocalypse, where the great dragon is described as the old serpent. This interpretation shaped the vision of generations of Christians, consolidating the serpent as a symbol of evil and opposition to God. However, modern theologians point out that this association, though powerful, reflects a theological reading than the original text itself. Outside the biblical tradition, the serpent often appears as an ambivalent symbol. In Mesopotamian culture, for example, snakes were associated with both healing and danger. Caduceus, a symbol of medicine to this day, has its roots in the belief that the snakes had regenerative powers. In Egyptian culture, they symbolized protection and destruction, representing both benevolent gods and threatening forces. These interpretations show that the snake in Genesis cannot be understood in isolation. It carries a cultural legacy that goes beyond the boundaries of the biblical account. Spiritually, the serpent also represents the constant human struggle between desire for knowledge and obedience to divine will. She challenges us to reflect. Does our pursuit of understanding bring us closer or depart from God? In a world that values autonomy and knowledge above all, as we can find balance between these searches and our faith. Finally, the serpent also raises a deep theological question. If God is sovereign, why allow a temptation agent to exist in Eden? Many scholars suggest that the presence of the serpent symbolizes God's love for human free will. He does not force him to obey him. Instead, it gives us the opportunity to choose you freely. But what can we learn from these interpretations in practice? Does the serpent, instead of being just a villain, invites us to better understand our own internal conflicts? In the next part, we will unravel how these reflections connect to the divine plan of redemption and the crucial role that the serpent plays in this larger story. When we come to the heart of this narrative, it is crucial to understand that the serpent in Genesis is not just an incidental or symbolic character. It plays an essential role in the unfolding of the divine plan, raising deep questions about the nature of sin, free will, and the eternal purpose of God to humanity. The Hebrew text, with its richness of meanings and nuances, allows us to exploit often neglected perspectives that can transform our view on this account. The Hebrew term used for serpent, nachash, as already explored, not only describes a creeping being, but is also associated with the idea of brightness and guessing. This connection suggests that the serpent was not just a physical figure, but an entity lined with a spiritual dimension, endowed with cunning and persuasive power. This interpretation sheds light on the nature of Eve faced. It was not a simple manipulation, but an intellectual and spiritual proof that tested their trust in God's plans. Spiritually, the serpent represents the eternal human dilemma, trusting divine sovereignty or giving in to the desire for independent control and knowledge. By eating from the fruit, Adam and Eve not only disobeyed, they expressed their doubt about God's sufficiency. This act, more than a transgression, reveals human fragility before the seductive invitation to become as God. However, within this fall, there is a deeper mystery. It was through this disobedience that God could reveal his plan of redemption, culminating in Christ. Surprisingly, the serpent becomes, by extension, an agent who leads to God's greatest show of love for humanity. Without the fall, there would be no need for redemption. Without the need for redemption, there would be no cross. Thus, the serpent, which initially symbolizes the removal of God, also points to the divine plan of restoration. It is a memory that God, in his infinite wisdom, transforms even the wrong human choices into opportunities to demonstrate his grace and love. In practice, this revelation invites us to reflect. How do we respond to temptations in our lives? Do we see in them only challenges, or also as opportunities to grow in our trust in God? Perhaps, like Eve in Eden, we often feel attracted to paths that promise instant satisfaction, but move away from true fullness. However, just as God sought Adam and Eve after the fall, he also seeks us, offering us reconciliation and a new beginning. Finally, it is impossible to ignore the parallel with the serpent in the narrative of the desert of Moses, where God instructs the people to look at the lounge of bronze erected to be healed from their diseases. This event, later, is interpreted as a symbol of Christ, who was erected on the cross to bring us the definitive spiritual healing. The serpent, therefore, paradoxically, becomes both a symbol of fall and redemption, pointing to the duality of our struggles and the sovereign love of God. What if the serpent is more than a temptation agent? What if she is ultimately a powerful illustration of how God uses even the darker situations to manifest his light? It doesn't come out yet, because at the conclusion of this journey, we will see how these lessons can transform our understanding of the Bible and our spiritual walk. Now that we unravel the serpent as a deep symbol of temptation, choice, and redemption, it is time to reflect on the lessons this biblical story offers to our lives in the present. Throughout our spiritual journey, we come across moments of temptation, doubt, and even disobedience, similar to those faced by Adam and Eve. But what the Bible teaches us about how to deal with these challenges so that our relationship with God is restored and strengthened, how can we apply these lessons to our daily lives? Firstly, we must recognize that the serpent, far from being a simple figure of wickedness, is a representation of all forces that seek to remove us from God. In our modern life, these forces can manifest in many ways: the unbridled desire for power, the search for control, the lies we believe about ourselves and about the world, or even the pressure of social conventions that move us away from spiritual values. All this calls us to reflect. Are we really trusting God's plans for our lives, or are we allowing ourselves to be seduced by the idea that we can do things in our own way? The story of Eve and Adam, despite his tragedy, teaches us that even when we fail, God offers us a chance of reconciliation. Just as he sought Adam and Eve after the fall, he also seeks us in our moments of failure. Repentance and confidence in your forgiveness are the first steps to restore our spiritual walk. We must therefore learn to recognize the temptations of our lives, and instead of giving them to them, seek in God the strength necessary to resist and remain firm in faith. Another crucial point that history brings us is the importance of free will. Temptation in the Garden of Eden reminds us that God created us with the ability to choose. The choice to obey or not to his commandments, though painful, is a reflection of the trust he deposits in us. Every decision we make reflects our commitment to the divine plan and our willingness to live according to your will. However, each wrong choice also offers us a learning opportunity to return to the path of truth and light. Moreover, this story challenges us to look beyond what seems to be a simple human error and see how God uses even the most difficult and confusing situations to reveal his wisdom and compassion. If, like the serpent, are we confronted by challenges in our lives, how can we use these experiences to grow spiritually? How can we, in the midst of our own falls, to perceive the opportunities for transformation and grace that God offers us? As we reflect on the serpent and the choice of Eve and Adam, we are invited to evaluate our own spiritual lives. Are we allowing the brightness of temptation to blind us? Or are we seeking the truth and divine knowledge that guide us for a full and true life? And most importantly, when we make mistakes, are we willing to seek God's forgiveness and allow him to teach us the lessons necessary for our spiritual growth? Now that you have reflected on these deep issues, it's time to think about your own journey. How can these lessons be applied to your daily life? What are the temptations you face, and how can you overcome them with God's help? Share with us your ideas and thoughts in the comments below, as your experience can be of great value to many. Do not miss the next step of this journey. Now let's go to the conclusion, where you will find out how Genesis's story can change the way you see the divine plan in your life. As we come to the end of our reflection on the history of the serpent in Genesis, we can see that this narrative is not just an ancient story, but a timeless parable with practical and spiritual lessons that continue to speak directly to our hearts. The journey of Adam and Eve, his disobedience, its consequences, and the promise of redemption echoes for all generations, showing that even in our failures, mercy and God's forgiveness are always more powerful. We must remember that despite the fall in the Garden of Eden, God has not abandoned them, and he never abandoned us, even when we were wrong. In times of temptation, in situations of doubt or sadness, he approaches us, as he did with Adam and Eve, and offers us the chance to start over. Sin can temporarily remove us from its presence, but sincere regret reconciles us with it, allowing our faith to be restored and our strengthened spiritual walk. The history of the serpent teaches us that instead of succumbing to despair at our mistakes, we must remember the divine promise that he will always be with us, ready to help us get up and move on. Free will, a divine gift, challenges us to make choices that reflect our commitment to God and His will. He does not force us to follow His ways, but offers us His orientation so that we can choose the good even when temptation is attractive. Each decision, large or small, has a spiritual impact, and the key to living faithful is learning to discern God's will and to act wisely, even in the face of difficulties. And this is where the true lesson of the serpent reveals itself. Temptation is an inevitable part of human life, but it does not have to define us. What defines our destination is how we choose to react before her. Contrary to Adam and Eve, who gave in to deception, we are called to resist sin and trust in God's promises, which offer us not only salvation, but also the power to transform our lives through faith. As we reflect on this story, we are called to look inside ourselves. How are we dealing with the temptations of life? Are we allowing the illusions and mistakes of the world to move us from God? Or are we seeking your truth, so that even in the midst of challenges, can we remain firm in our faith? Our goal here is not only to understand the words of Genesis, but also to apply their lessons in our daily lives. Each day is a new opportunity to choose obedience to God, to resist sin, and to live with a pure heart, always seeking your grace. Remember, the failure is not the end of the story, but the starting point for reconciliation and restoration. The invitation is always open to return to the path of truth and life, with the certainty that, as He did with Adam and Eve, God will also seek us when we move away. Now we want to invite you to reflect on what you have learned in this video and how you can apply these truths on your own spiritual journey. What steps will you take from now on to resist temptations and live with more faith and wisdom? Share your reflections in the comments, as they can be a source of inspiration to others who are facing similar challenges. If you have been touched by this message, be sure to subscribe to the channel, activate the bell so as not to lose any video, and share this content with friends and family that can benefit from these biblical lessons. Remember, together we can grow in faith, strengthen our spirituality, and above all, walk closer to God. His grace is abundant, and with it, we can face any challenge. May the peace of God be with you in every step of your journey.